It's about to get interesting, so subscribe and hit like so you don't miss the top content.
5 years after I learned of my ex-wife Sarah's betrayal of me, I thought my life had finally found stability. I lived in a small town in the American Midwest, far from the bustling metropolis and the memories that once tore at my heart. Here, amidst endless fields and quiet streets, I found my solitude. My children, Lily and Jacob, were already accustomed to their new life. They spent time alternating between Sarah and me, and though the divorce left scars, we tried to make them feel loved and protected. I worked at the local library, a quiet place where time flowed slowly and books became my faithful companions. It wasn't the life I had once dreamed of, but it was peaceful. I learned to appreciate that calm. After everything that had happened, it became something of an escape for me. But one evening, as I sat on the porch of my house, watching the sun set over the horizon, my phone rang. A name popped up on the screen that I hadn't seen in years. Sarah. My heart sank. We hadn't communicated in person in a long time, only through messages regarding the kids. What could have made her call? I picked up the phone, and her voice that had once been so familiar came through on the other end of the line. She spoke quickly, with a note of anxiety that I couldn't help but notice. She said she needed to talk to me, not about the kids, not about money, but about something important, something that would change everything. I agreed to meet her, even though I was resisting the idea inside. We agreed to see each other at a cafe in a neighboring town, neutral territory where we could talk without too many eyes and ears. As I drove there, my thoughts were in chaos. What could she say? Why now, after all these years? When I walked into the cafe, she was already sitting at a table by the window. She looked different, more tired, more serious. Her once bright eyes now seemed dull, and her face was troubled. She smiled at me, but it wasn't the smile I remembered. It was the smile of a man carrying a burden he could not keep silent about. We started the conversation on a technicality, asking each other about life, about children, about work, but I felt it was only for play. She was hiding something, and I knew that sooner or later it would come out. And then she started talking. She told me about what had happened 5 years ago, but not in the way I remembered it. She talked about her feelings, about her fears, about how she had lost herself in our marriage. She admitted that her cheating wasn't just a mistake, but a cry for help that I didn't hear. She said she'd been living with guilt all this time, guilt that kept her stuck. But that was just the beginning. She told me about what had happened over the past few months, about how she had encountered something that made her reevaluate her whole life. She talked about how our divorce wasn't the end, but the beginning of something new, for her, for me, for us. I listened to her, feeling my heart beat faster and faster. I didn't know what to say. I didn't know how to react, but I knew one thing. Her words changed everything. They made me look at the past in a new way, at our lives, at our mistakes, and they made me think about the future. That maybe all is not lost. Sarah's words hung in the air like a heavy fog that I couldn't dispel. I sat at a cafe table, clutching a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. My thoughts were jumbled, jumping from one memory to the next. For 5 years I'd lived my life thinking that it was all behind me, that I'd accepted the way things had turned out. But now, after her words, I could feel the old wounds starting to bleed again. She talked about how her cheating wasn't just a betrayal, but a desperate attempt to find herself. She confessed that she felt lost in our marriage, that she felt like she was dissolving into the roles of wife and mother, losing her identity. She said that back then, 5 years ago, she didn't know how else to express her pain, and chose the most destructive path. As I listened to her, two feelings fought inside me, anger and understanding. Anger that she had destroyed our family, that she hadn't found the strength to talk to me before taking such a step, and understanding, because I could also feel our relationship growing more and more distant, how we were no longer a team, but I never thought it would go this far. Sarah continued to talk. She talked about how she had tried to start a new life after her divorce, how she had dated the same man, but their relationship had fallen apart quickly. She realized that he was no salvation, just an escape from reality. She said that all this time she had been living with guilt that kept her down. She tried to drown it out with work, new relationships, but nothing worked. Then, a few months ago, she came across something that made her stop and reevaluate her entire life. She wouldn't go into detail, but I realized it was something serious, perhaps an illness, the loss of someone close, or just a moment of insight. She said she realized how much she had lost and how much she wanted to make it right. I sat her in silence, not knowing what to say. Part of me wanted to scream, to blame her, to remind her how much pain she caused me, but the other part, the part that still remembered how much we'd once loved each other, wanted to understand her, wanted to give her a chance. She looked at me, and in her eyes, I saw something I hadn't seen in years: sincerity. She said she didn't expect me to forgive her right away, that she understood how much pain she had caused me, but she wanted me to know the truth, the whole truth. We sat in silence for a few minutes, each absorbed in his own thoughts. I felt my heart torn between wanting to walk away and leave it at that, and wanting to try to understand her. In the end, I just nodded and said I needed time to make sense of everything she said, time to decide what to do next. She smiled, and there was something sad but grateful in her smile. She said she understood and that she would wait. We paid and walked out of the cafe. She got into her car and drove away, and I was left standing in the parking lot, feeling the world around me begin to change again. I got home, but I couldn't sleep. My thoughts were crowded. I thought about Sarah, about our children, about how things could have been if we had done things differently. I thought about how maybe we still had a chance, not as a couple, but as people who once loved each other and could now find a way to be there for the kids. The next morning, I called Sarah. I told her I was ready to talk, not about bringing back the past, but about building something new, something that would help us both move forward. She agreed, and I could hear the relief in her voice. Since then, we began to slowly, step by step, rebuild our relationship, not as husband and wife, but as parents who want the best for their children. We started spending more time together, talking, sharing our thoughts and feelings. Even though the past was still between us, I felt like we were finally starting to find a way to live with it. A few more months passed, and I realized that her phone call that night really changed everything. It made me look at our life in a new way, to realize that even after the most painful betrayal, you can find a way to move forward. And while I still don't know what the future holds, I do know one thing: we're no longer running from the past. We're learning to live with it, and maybe that's the most important thing of all. It's been months since that night. I stood in the parking lot of the cafe, watching Sarah's car disappear into the darkness. Her words still echoed in my head like an echo that couldn't be drowned out. I got home and went to bed, but sleep didn't come. Instead, I lay staring at the ceiling, thinking about what she'd said, about her pain, about her guilt, about how she was trying to find herself, and how all this time I had only seen my side of the story. It was a strange feeling, a mixture of anger, pity, and something else I couldn't name at the time. Perhaps it was hope, or fear, or both together. I woke up the next morning with a heavy head, as if after a long illness. The coffee didn't help, nor did the work in the library. I shelved the books, but my thoughts were far away. I thought back to my life with Sarah before the divorce, how we'd laughed at stupid jokes, how we planned for the future, how happy we'd been when Lily and Jacob were born, and how then it all started to fall apart, slowly, imperceptibly, until it collapsed altogether. I thought I knew why it had happened, but now, after what she'd said, I was beginning to doubt it. Maybe it was my fault too. Maybe I hadn't seen her, hadn't heard her, hadn't noticed her drowning in her fears. The thought was unpleasant, but I couldn't push it away. I decided to call her, not right away, of course. At first I sat with the phone in my hands for a long time, going over in my head what to say. I didn't want to yell. I didn't want to accuse. I just wanted to understand. When I finally dialed her number, my fingers trembled like a teenager's before a first date. She answered quickly, and I could sense the relief in her voice. I said I was ready to talk, but not about the past as something that could be brought back, but about how to move on. She agreed, and we agreed to meet again, this time at my house, to keep things simple, without prying eyes. When she arrived, I felt strange. She stood on the doorstep of my house, where we had once lived together, looking familiar and foreign at the same time. I invited her in, poured us both some tea, and we sat down at the kitchen table. The conversation began slowly, with pauses, with awkward glances. I didn't know where to start, but then I just asked her what she meant when she said she wanted to make things right. She hesitated, looking into her cup, and then started talking. I listened, trying not to interrupt, not to argue, just absorbing her words. She talked about how she'd spent the last few years trying to figure out who she'd become after the divorce, how she'd struggled with guilt, how she tried to be a good mother to Lily and Jacob even when she felt broken herself. She said she wanted the kids to have a family, not necessarily the same family as before, but something where we'd both be there to support them. I nodded, because that was what I wanted to. I told her I wasn't sure if I could forgive her completely, but I was willing to try to be something more than enemies for the sake of the kids. She looked at me with gratitude, and I realized that was the first step, a small, tentative step, but a step. From that day on, we started to meet more often. At first, it was short conversations about the children, who would pick them up from school, who would take them to training. Then we started to discuss other things, work, the weather, some small things from everyday life. I noticed that it became easier for me to talk to her, that the tension between us began to dissolve. One day, I even caught myself laughing at her joke, and it was strange but pleasant. We weren't trying to get back to the way things were, but we were building something new, carefully, like picking up a mosaic of shards. Lily and Jacob noticed the change. They started asking more often if we were going to spend time together, and I could see how happy that made them. One day we went on a picnic. We just grabbed some food and blankets and headed to a lake outside of town. I watched the kids run around in the grass as Sarah helped them fly a kite, and it felt right. Not perfect, not without pain, but right. I realized that I don't have to run away from the past anymore. I could live with it, accept it, and move on. A few more months passed, and our lives began to take on a new rhythm. I still worked at the library, but now I would occasionally bring books for Sarah. She loved to read, and I knew she would love it. We started spending weekends together with the kids, sometimes just walking, sometimes watching movies at home. I noticed that I began to think of her not as an ex-wife, but as someone with whom I shared a common history and common goals. It was a strange feeling, but it gave me peace. One evening, when the kids were already asleep, we were sitting on the porch of my house. The sky was clear, the stars were shining brightly, and I suddenly remembered how Sarah and I had dreamed about the future when we first started dating. I told her about it, and she smiled, but there was sadness in her smile. She admitted that she often thinks about how things could have been if we had both been more honest with each other back then. I agreed, but added that maybe things happened the way they were supposed to. We've both changed, become different, and now we have a chance to do better. I don't know what will happen next. Sometimes I still feel the pain when I remember her cheating, but it's not as sharp as it used to be. I've learned to look at it not as a betrayal, but as part of our history that brought us here. Sarah and I aren't a couple, and probably never will be, but we've become something else: allies, parents, people learning to live again. Lily and Jacob are growing up, and I can see how happy they are when we're all together. It's not the family I once dreamed of, but it's my family, and I'm ready to cherish it. Every day I wake up thinking that life goes on. I go to the library, put my books away, drink coffee on the porch, and watch the sunset. Sometimes I think about that phone call from Sarah that turned everything around, and I realize that it didn't destroy my stability, but gave me something more, an opportunity to understand, to forgive, to move forward. And while I don't know what awaits us in a year or 5, I am sure of one thing: I am no longer afraid of the past. I live with it, and that's enough. It's been another year since Sarah and I started building our new reality. Life had moved on, and I had grown accustomed to this strange but comfortable routine. I started the morning with the usual ritual of making coffee, making sure Lily and Jacob had packed their backpacks, and walking them to school if it was my day. Then I go to the library, where time passed slowly but counselly. Amid the rustle of pages and the smell of old books, work became not just a way to earn money, but a refuge where I could put my thoughts in order. After my shift, I come home, sometimes cook dinner, sometimes just sit on the porch, watching the sunset and thinking about how far we'd come. Sarah became part of that routine, not every day, but often enough for me to get used to her presence. We continued to see each other for the kids, but now it was more than just parenting. We talked about life, about the past, about whatever was bothering us. I noticed that I began to think less of her cheating as a wound and more as a scar. It was still there, but it didn't hurt as much anymore. Sometimes I even caught myself thinking that I was glad to see her, that her calm voice and soft smile brought me some kind of peace. The kids were growing up fast. Lily was already finishing elementary school, and I could see her becoming more and more independent. She loved to read as much as I did, and often came to my library after school to borrow a new book. Jacob was into soccer, and I tried not to miss his games, even if it meant rearranging my schedule. They were both excited when Sarah and I were together at their events, whether it was a school play or a game on the field. I could see how it made them feel safe, and I realized that everything we did was for their sake. One spring day, Sarah suggested that we take a weekend trip out of town as a family. She found a small cabin by a lake about an hour from our town, and said the kids would love it. I agreed, though I still had doubts stirring inside me. We weren't a family in the classic sense, and I was afraid that such a trip might create false expectations in the kids or even in myself. But I decided to take the risk, because I could see how excited Lily and Jacob were about the idea. We arrived at the lake on Friday night. The cabin was simple but cozy, with wooden walls and large windows overlooking the water. The kids immediately went to explore the neighborhood, and I helped Sarah unload the car. We worked in silence, but this silence wasn't awkward, it was as natural as breathing. Later, we all Saturday around the fire together, roasting marshmallows and listening to the wood crackle. Lily was telling stories she made up, and Jacob was trying to catch fireflies. I watched them, and I felt something inside me let go, maybe the last vestiges of resentment or fear. The next day we walked in the woods, fished, and went boating. I noticed that Sarah laughed more often, and her laughter sounded more genuine than before. I felt lighter than usual, too. At one point, when the kids left to gather rocks on the shore, it was just the two of us by the water. I looked at the lake, at the way the sun reflected in its surface, and suddenly realized that I felt good, not just calm, but really good. I turned to her and told her I was glad we were here. She nodded, and I saw something warm in her eyes, something I hadn't noticed before. Something had changed since that trip, not drastically, not obviously, but I started to notice that I thought about Sarah more often, not as an ex-wife or the mother of my children, but as someone who was close to me again. I wasn't jumping to conclusions, because I knew how fragile everything we built was, but I couldn't deny that her presence in my life had come to mean more than I had expected. The summer passed quickly. The kids left for camp for a couple weeks, and I was left alone. Usually I enjoyed the quiet, but this time I was uneasy. I caught myself missing their noisy footsteps, their voices, and Sarah too. She called occasionally to tell me how the kids were doing, and I noticed that those conversations were taking longer than they should. We talked about Lily and Jacob, but also about our plans, our thoughts, our little joys. When the kids got back, Sarah and I decided to surprise them with a trip to the amusement park. They were thrilled, and we spent the whole day together, riding the carousel, eating cotton candy, and laughing until we cried. I watched Sarah, the way she held Jacob's hand, the way she helped Lily pick out a souvenir, and I felt my heart beat faster. It wasn't just a memory of the past, but something new that was growing inside of me. In the fall, I began to notice that my feelings for her were changing. I didn't want to call it love, there was too much pain associated with that word, but I couldn't deny that she had become important to me, that her presence was giving my life meaning. One evening, as we Saturday at my house after dinner with the kids, I ventured to talk about it. I wasn't sure how to start, but I just said that I liked the way things were working out between us, and that I didn't want it to end. She looked at me with surprise, then smiled and said she felt the same way. We didn't make things complicated. There were no loud promises or plans for the future. We just decided to keep moving forward, together, but taking our time. I realized that the past wasn't going anywhere, that the scars would remain, but now I saw them not just as pain, but as the history that had made us who we were. Sarah and I had grown closer, not as a couple in the full sense, but as people who found support and understanding in each other. Winter came with the first snowfalls, and I watched the children play in the yard as Sarah sculpted a snowman with them. I stood on the porch with a mug of hot tea and thought that life had given me a second chance, not for love, as in my youth, but for something deeper, for acceptance, for connection, for family in a new form. I didn't know where it would take us, but for the first time in years, I felt ready to move on without looking back, and that was enough. It's been another year since Sarah and I began this slow, careful journey towards something new. Winter changed to spring, and then summer came again, and I looked at our life with a kind of quiet gratitude. Everything that was happening was like rebuilding an old house step by step, with cracks that can't be completely mended, but that you can learn to accept as part of the story. I had gotten used to Sarah becoming a permanent part of my world, not as a shadow of the past, but as someone with whom I shared the present. We didn't call it a relationship in the usual sense, but something solid had grown between us, something that kept us together even on the most difficult days. I still worked at the library, and it was still my refuge. Every morning I'd go there, put the books away, and say hello to the patrons who already knew me by name. Sometimes I take home something, for Sarah a historical novel or a collection of short stories. Knowing she'd appreciate it, she started dropping by my office more often, bringing me coffee or just sitting in the reading room while I finished my shift. I noticed how her presence filled this quiet place with warmth, and I liked it more than I was willing to admit. The kids continued to grow, and I watched them blossom. Lily took up writing, filling notebooks with her stories, and I was proud to read every page, even if she was embarrassed to show them to anyone else. Jacob became the real star of the school soccer team, and I didn't miss any of his matches, sitting in the stands with a thermos of tea and shouting his name when he scored a goal. Sarah was often around, and we cheered their successes together, looking over at each other with a smile that said more than words could say. I realized that it was for their sake that we had started all this, but now it was more than just a parental duty. It was a hot summer that year, and I decided we needed to get out to the lake again. Sarah and I rented the same cabin, and I watched the kids excitedly pack their bags as Sarah prepared a basket of food, and I felt like it was no longer just a trip, but a tradition. When we arrived, I stood on the shore, looking out at the water, and remembered how a year ago, this was the first time I felt good around her here. Now that feeling was deeper, more confident. We spent the weekend as we had been fishing, roasting marshmallows, walking in the woods. I looked at Sarah, at her sun-touched hair, at her calm smile, and realized that she was no longer a stranger. She was part of my life, part of me. In the fall, I began to notice that I thought of her differently, not just as the mother of my children, or an ally in our strange union, but as a woman who had once again taken a place in my heart. It scared me, because I remembered how painful it had been to lose her before, but I couldn't ignore how my spirits lifted when she called, how I waited for her footsteps on the porch, how her laughter became the sound most dear to me. One evening, after the kids had gone to a friend's house, I sat at home alone and suddenly realized I miss her. Not the kids, not our routine, but her. It was a strange discovery, and I didn't know what to make of it for a long time. I decided to talk to her about it, but not right away. I thought about my words for days, running them through my head, while I laid out my books or watched the sunset. Finally, I invited her over to my place when the kids were at her place. I made coffee and we sat on the couch, looking at the fire in the fireplace. I started from afar, told her I appreciated everything we had, that I loved how we'd grown closer. Then I fell silent, gathering my wits, and simply said that she meant more to me than I thought. I didn't ask for an answer. I didn't expect promises. I just wanted her to know. She looked at me, and in her eyes I saw surprise and then warmth. She didn't say anything specific, just nodded and squeezed my hand, and that was enough. From that night on, we grew even closer. I didn't rush things, didn't try to label what was happening between us. We went on with our lives. I worked. She did her own thing. We rejoiced in the children's successes together. But there was more kindredness in it now, more glances that lingered a little longer, more casual touches that I caught myself memorizing. I noticed the way she smiled when I told her something funny, the way she fixed her hair when she thought I wasn't looking, and I felt my heart, which had been closed for so long, begin to open again. Winter came with cold weather, and I watched the snow cover our small town. Sarah and I decided to give the kids a real party, decorating my house with lights, decorating the tree, baking cookies. I stood in the kitchen, watching her teach Lily how to make icing, watching Jacob try to steal a piece of dough, and I felt like this was happiness. Not loud, not perfect, but quiet, present. I realized that the past hadn't gone anywhere. The cheating, the pain, the divorce were still part of our history, but now I saw it not only as the end, but the beginning of something new, something we had built on our own. Another month passed, and I began to think about the future. Not what would happen in 10 years, but what would happen tomorrow, in a week, in a year. I imagined Sarah and I sitting on the porch, already old, with gray hair, and watching the sunset. I saw Lily and Jacob coming over with their families, us laughing about old stories. They weren't dreams, just thoughts that came to me naturally, without fear. I realized that I was no longer afraid of what might happen because I knew we could handle it together. One spring day, I woke up early. The sky was clear. The sun was just starting to rise, and I was out on the porch with a cup of coffee. I looked out at the fields that stretched to the horizon and thought about how far I'd come from that evening when Sarah called me for the first time after so many years of silence. At that time, I had thought my life was settled, that I had found my peace in solitude. But now I realized that the call didn't destroy my stability, but gave me a chance for something more, for family, for connection, for acceptance. I finished my coffee and went inside to get ready for work. The day went as usual: books, visitors, quiet conversations. In the evening, Sarah came over to my house with the kids, and we decided to watch a movie. I sat on the couch, feeling the warmth of her shoulder next to mine, hearing Lily and Jacob laughing, and suddenly I realized that this was the end of one story and the beginning of another. Not the one from 5 years ago, full of pain and disappointment, and not the one I'd imagined when I was young, full of naive hope. This was our story, my story, Sarah's story, our children's story, the story of how we lost each other and then found each other again, not as we were, but different, but still connected. I stared at the screen, but thought about how we got into this point, how I'd forgiven her, not immediately, not completely, but enough to move on, how she found the strength to open up to me, to tell me the truth, to risk being close to me again, how the children became a bridge between us, and then we built something more on our own. I realized it wasn't the end in the usual sense. Life went on, and there were new days ahead of us, new challenges, new joys, but it was the end of the part of the journey where I doubted, where I feared, where I didn't know if I could trust again. Now I knew. I trusted her. I trusted myself. I trusted what we had created. It wasn't a perfect fairy tale, but it was real. I looked at Sarah, her profile illuminated by the light of the TV, and felt my heart calm, not because everything was resolved, but because I had accepted everything, past, present, future. I was no longer running from memories, no longer seeking solitude as an escape. I lived, here and now, with the people I cared about. The movie ended. The kids went to bed, and Sarah and I were left to sit in silence. I took her hand without saying a word, and she squeezed mine in return. We sat like that, looking at the fading light in the room, and I knew that this was my home, not the walls, not the porch, not the books in the library, but this feeling of being with her, with them, with myself. And I knew that whatever road lay ahead, I was ready to walk it, because now I was not alone.